And now let's take a closer look at Jimmy Carter's life and legacy. Joining us is Frank Sesno. He's a professor at George Washington University and a former White House correspondent and Washington bureau chief at CNN. Frank, thanks so much for coming on with us.
My pleasure.
So he was the oldest living former U.S. president, overcame numerous health setbacks. Some say he was ahead of his time. Others say he was a better ex-president, but a failed president in large part due to the Iran hostage crisis and a bad economy. We want to get into his domestic and foreign policy in a minute. But just what is your own impression of him overall as a statesman?
Overall, as a statesman, he rose to the occasion. I mean, he's been treated very harshly by history. History has remembered him, and the popular culture here in the United States has remembered him as the president who was in office for the Iranian hostage crisis, for high inflation, super high interest rates, and gas lines. But as you just heard in the story that was just presented, Jimmy Carter was the man who normalized relations with the people, with China. He was the man who, after incredible hard work and up against massive odds, secured the Camp David peace accords, which led to normalization of relations between Egypt and Israel and completely transformed the Middle East. He had a host, and we could talk about this separately too, if you'd like, of domestic achievements. He just never could get out from under that shadow at the end of his presidency of those gas lines and inflation, and for so much of his presidency, the Iranian hostage crisis, which in many ways defined the Carter presidency.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And as you say, there are layers to his legacy. On that domestic side first, talk about some of his accomplishments during that presidency. He served at a pivotal time in our country.
It was a pivotal time in our country. I mean, he deregulated the airline industry here in the United States. He deregulated the communication industry. It's one of the reasons we have all the competition and even the internet that we've got today. He started and established the Department of Education and the Department of Energy here in the United States. He was a champion for civil rights, and he was the first president elected from the deep south of the United States since Reconstruction following the Civil War that ended in 1865. So he broke a lot of barriers. He also, and this may be really the key to understanding his place in history at the moment he was elected, he was the president who came out of Watergate. Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford, Nixon's vice president, who was defeated by Carter largely because Ford had pardoned Nixon. Carter was looked to as the man who could rise above the Watergate scandal, above the division that had so torn apart America. And he was that sort of honest outsider, peanut farmer from Georgia. And he did promise in his campaign, "I will never lie to you." And that was a direct response to the lying that had been so common and so divisive and damaging during the Nixon presidency. So it was a very complicated, divisive time. And he, as I mentioned, domestically actually achieved quite a bit.
His biggest foreign policy victory was, of course, the Camp David Accord brokering that peace between Israel and Egypt. Can you help characterize just how important and how difficult that was to broker that deal at that time of turmoil? It was 13 days of real personal diplomacy. He kept Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat at Camp David and ironed out that agreement.
Personally, going between the cabins, negotiating directly with them. And it wasn't clear it was going to succeed, and it almost didn't succeed. I mean, it was incredibly dramatic. And remember, we were coming right out of recently of a war in the Middle East, the oil shocks that rumbled out of the Middle East. I mean, it was almost like everything was at stake here. And if Carter had failed at that, it would have been more than just the diplomatic failure. But indeed, in fact, as we know now, he triumphed, and it changed very dramatically the trajectory of the Middle East. It was at the time not Iran, but Egypt that was the dominant power in the Middle East. So to have Egypt and Israel make peace was a remarkable breakthrough. Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt at the time, ultimately paid with his life because it wasn't as popular, obviously, in Egypt as it was elsewhere, and he was assassinated. So the tumult in the Middle East, unfortunately, continued. But the normalization, the peace, the formal peace agreement between Israel and Egypt was dramatic and transformative.
Yeah, it was absolutely groundbreaking. And, Egypt then recognized Israel, gave them access to the Suez Canal. Very, very huge.
Well, Anwar Sadat went to Israel and spoke to the Knesset, to the parliament there.
Exactly.
It was an incredible and very dramatic breakthrough.
Let's talk about his most enduring legacy, which came after the White House, many believe, with his humanitarian efforts, which he worked on with his wife, Rosalind.
His humanitarian efforts, and it's not just his humanitarian efforts. He, through the Carter Center in Atlanta, set up a whole election observation team. And so Carter and others would go to emerging democracies or democracies that were in peril or under siege and personally observe elections to help to certify that they were free and fair. He also got involved, as you said, in a lot of humanitarian efforts. Here in the United States, he was very involved in what's called Habitat for Humanity. And well into his 90s, he would show up and be building homes for people who were low-income people, and this was their first access to home ownership. He also ticked off, annoyed the administration, the U.S. administration at times. I remember I was at CNN. In fact, I interviewed Jimmy Carter after his 1994 mission to North Korea, where he personally intervened because he felt the Clinton administration and North Korea were on a very dangerous path toward war, and in fact they were. And his personal intervention got the Koreans to back off of their nuclear program for some time and calmed that situation. The Clinton White House was furious about it, but Jimmy Carter went anyway. And when I interviewed him after he was back, he had no apologies for that because he said he had connections to the North Koreans. He also had very good relations with the Chinese leadership, which intervened. And so he was willing to use his influence in that post-presidency, as you say, in a variety of ways and to very significant effect.
Yeah, in many ways, a man ahead of his time. All right, we will have to leave it there. Frank Sesno, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.